Well, good evening. My name is Michelle Place, and I'm the Executive Director for the Tulsa Historical Society and Museum. Tonight, I am thrilled to be participating in a conversation with Hannibal Johnson about his latest book, Black Wall Street 100. I have my copy here, well worn, marked up, highlighted, etc. Some things that I want to talk to you about. But in addition to talking to you, Hannibal, about your book, I'd like to touch on a few other subjects about race relations, both in our community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and also beyond. I should mention that Black Wall Street 100 is available for sale at the Tulsa Historical Society and Museum in our gift shop. We're open Tuesday through Saturday from 10 a.m. until 3 p.m. I also would like for our audience to be aware that we are recording this conversation, and it will be made available on some other platforms. We'll be posting through our social media how and when you can obtain that. For some other housekeeping, this transmission will go for about an hour. Please feel free to submit questions through the chat room, and I'll do my best to present them to Hannibal as our time allows. Well, several years ago, the staff, the volunteers, and the board of the Tulsa Historical Society made the commitment to ourselves and also to the world that we would make everything in our archives that has to do with Greenwood, Black Wall Street, anything that we had in our archives, or the Race Massacre, we would make it available through our website, and therefore it's available globally. Currently, we have 642 separate images of photographs, documents, and artifacts that are available for your viewing. With this technology, we are saying to the world, we are holding nothing back. Everything is available for review by the media, professional historians, students of all ages, or those who just want to know more about the story, this horrific event in our city. For additional information, I would invite you to visit our website, which is www.tulsahistory.org/learn, and you can find everything in our Tulsa Race Massacre collection there. Well, Hannibal B. Johnson is a graduate of Harvard Law School. His undergraduate work was done at the University of Arkansas, where he completed a double major in economics and sociology. He's an attorney, an author, an independent consultant, and he specializes in diversity and inclusion, cultural competency issues. He's also served as an adjunct professor at Oklahoma State University, University of Tulsa College of Law, and the University of Oklahoma. Besides being a good friend to me personally, he's a great supporter of the Tulsa Historical Society and Museum, and he's helped us with a number of projects. Hannibal also serves on the 1619 Education Project, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So welcome, Hannibal. We appreciate your time and your commitment to telling more of the story. And for information for everyone, we had over 100 people register for this event. So we were very excited when those numbers started coming in. Well, let's begin with the basics. Because this conversation is being recorded, and it's quite possible that it will be used as an educational tool, I think that we ought to start at the beginning. Maybe we have someone listening who's just now learning about the story. So if you could give us your Cliff Notes version, how's that, of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre.
It's great to be here, first of all. And let me just say at the outset that one of the things that's important about the massacre itself is contextualization. So the massacre didn't happen in an isolation, nor is it the story. The story is about a particular group of people who were visionary, who were persistent, and who were resilient. Massacre is an event that happened, these people had to respond to. And so the massacre would be as a chapter in a book. The book would be about the Greenwood community. Having said that, I can describe the events of the massacre, the run-up and the immediate aftermath in a real, I think, summary fashion. So the Greenwood district, the historic Black community in Tulsa, begins in 1906. Following O.W. Gurley, who was from Arkansas, he was relatively wealthy. He came to Oklahoma in the land run in 1889. He ended up moving to Tulsa. He bought some land. He established several businesses on Greenwood. He sold some of his land to other African Americans. He established a grocery store, the Gurley Hotel, other businesses. Businesses began to proliferate after that. This became what I consider to be a veritable Black Main Street. In other words, the businesses in the Greenwood community are mostly mom and pop type operations, sole proprietorships, barbershops, beauty parlors, movie theaters, dance halls, pool halls, grocery stores, restaurants, haberdasheries, furriers, service providers like doctors, lawyers, dentists, and pharmacists. It was not a Black Wall Street in the sense of being an investment or financial capital or center. It was a Black Wall Street only because Wall Street was kind of a common moniker for business acumen. That's why it's referred to as Black Wall Street. So businesses proliferated in the context of systemic racism that affected the United States more generally. Because the massacre in 1921 in Tulsa happens on the heels of Red Summer, the summer and fall of 1919, where there were so-called race riots all throughout the United States in places like New York and Baltimore, Washington, Omaha, Longview, Texas, Elaine, Arkansas, and on and on and on. It also comes in the midst of lynching, which is spreading all throughout the United States. Most of the lynching victims are African American, and lynching is a form of domestic terrorism, whereby people are targeted, and the intent is not simply to punish and often murder these people. The point is to send a message about white supremacy. That's the whole point of lynching. So that's the context, the kind of racial crucible in which the massacre occurs in 1921 in Tulsa. The massacre was triggered by Sarah Page on an elevator in the downtown Drexelville. But that is only a trigger incident. That is not part of the root causes of what happened here in Tulsa. The event transpires, as best we can determine, 100 to 300 people were killed, hundreds of others were injured, at least 1,250 homes were destroyed in the Black community. Black people were interned, very much like people of Japanese ancestry were interned in World War II. They were taken to these detention centers throughout Tulsa. They had to have a green card, a literal green card, countersigned by a white person who would vouch for them to get them out of these internment centers. And then finally, many Black families spent days, weeks, and months living in tent cities set up by the Red Cross. Red Cross provided relief effort. And the other thing I want to say that I think is important in terms of the racial dynamics here is that there were racial allies even then. Even in this horrific racial context, we had the Red Cross, which is led by Maurice Willows. Bob Hauer, the late newsman from Channel 8, his grandfather, Maurice Willows, led the Red Cross effort. He was white. First Presbyterian Church downtown, the leader of that church, Dr. Charles Kerr, was a real ally to the Black community during this tumultuous period. And Holy Family Cathedral downtown sheltered some of the folks who were fleeing the Greenwood community as it was in flames during the massacre. There were these allies. Long story short, even after this vicious physical onslaught and a veritable psychological warfare against the Black community, most of the people in the Black community vowed that they would not be moved. So they rebounded and they rebuilt using whatever resources they could find. And the Greenwood community, as a business community, peaks in the early to mid 1940s, begins to decline in the 60s and 70s and the 80s on account of immigration and urban renewal and a host of other social, economic, political factors. Today in the Greenwood community, we have an integrated community. It's an amalgam of residential, commercial, educational, religious, and entertainment interests. It's a community sort of in search of a new identity, a new iteration of the Black Wall Street that once existed. And I have the pleasure and privilege of serving on the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission. And part of our goal is to bring the community together under a sort of common umbrella and a collaborative spirit so that we can preserve this history, showcase the history, and leverage the history to surmount some of the racial challenges that exist.
Yeah, there's the cliff notes of it, and certainly there are a lot of more things to it, more history even before 1900, and if we have a chance, we'll circle back and get to those. Probably one of the biggest things that I hear at the Historical Society, whether it comes on a phone or if I'm out doing a program somewhere else, is this anger that people didn't hear about the story. It wasn't in my schools, it wasn't in my history book, et cetera, et cetera. So why do you think, what can you say from a historical perspective as to why it was never told, and what do you think the future holds in terms of how much we will be talking about it and efforts?
Yeah, well, as Americans, we don't do a really good job of dealing with hard history, particularly history around race. There's a tendency to whitewash this history. It's no different here. We can look at some of the psychological dynamics that may have been partially responsible for burying this history. Post-traumatic stress disorder in the Black community, the fear that this might recur in the Black community, shame in the white community, blame. We have to remember that when the massacre occurred in 1921, Tulsa was on an upward trajectory, becoming the self-described oil capital of the world. So the white leadership of Tulsa had an interest in minimizing this horrific event because Tulsa wanted a place on the national, if not the world stage, as the oil capital. So to bury this history was something that was thought to be in the interest of Tulsa as an entity that is gaining national renown. It's only relatively recently that we've begun talking about this history in earnest. There was an article published in a magazine called Impact on the 50th anniversary of 1971 that generated some interest, but also generated death threats for the author of the article. Scott Ellsworth, who's a friend, a professor at the University of Michigan, wrote a book called Death in a Promised Land as a student under the tutelage of Dr. John Franklin. That book came out, I believe, in 1982. That was the seminal accounting of the massacre. At the time, drew a lot of attention. But the real key to unlocking this history came between 1997 and 2001, when what was called then the Oklahoma Commission to Study the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921 was formed. This commission met for 4 years, issued an award-winning report in 2001 that's available on the website of the Oklahoma Historical Society. It's kind of the definitive accounting of the facts surrounding the massacre. It also includes some recommendations with regard to reparations. We at the Centennial Commission today are working really hard to make sure that this history is included in the regular curriculum, because that is the way that we preserve this history across generations. It needs to be not supplementary, but in the regular curriculum. We've even had conversations with the State Superintendent of Education, the governor, and other folks about seeing whether we can incorporate some questions from this history on state-mandated tests, so the teachers have yet another incentive to teach this history. It's that important.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I always respond to people who are asking about that and angry because they didn't know about it. And so part of my response is, when you teach for the test, teach for the test, and you don't even have Oklahoma history on your national and standardized test. And with teachers so limited in times, and it takes the exceptional teacher, someone who's really committed to bring that into their classroom. So I'm wondering what that means. Can you talk a little further about grades where that would be taught? I know that we have curriculum that is available that can be massaged for whatever age group, but talk a little bit more about who you're really targeting at what age, and some more about those conversations with the governor.
Yeah, so this history can be taught at multiple ages across multiple disciplines. And I know this personally. I have a book called Up From the Ashes that's written on the third grade reading level. I can't tell you how many second and third graders I've talked to about this history. And they can understand basic concepts if it's presented at their level. So my book is an illustrated kids book, again, on the third grade reading level. And when I read the book to kids, they can talk about what's fair and what's not fair, what's right and what's not right, what seems to benefit everybody and what seems to really target some people for adverse treatment. Those are not words that they use, but they get the concepts. So one of the things that we're doing at the Centennial Commission, we've created a summer institute. We've had 3 iterations of the summer institute. We bring teachers together and immerse them in this history over several days. Part of the challenge with hard history is that teachers are human beings. And so a lot of them don't feel equipped or comfortable to take on this hard history. So we have to get them a level of comfort, not just substantively, but emotionally, to be able to teach this history. So they learn the substance, but they also learn pedagogy, how best to teach the history to various grade levels, and they share and design curricula. It's a really wonderful process. As you might imagine, it's done on a relatively small scale because it's so experiential and interactive. So to scale up this process requires repeating the cycle of these seminars, which is a pretty substantial investment of funding. So we're looking at funding options, grant opportunities, and so forth, so that we could replicate what we're doing in terms of this institute, reach more teachers, get teachers equipped to teach other teachers, so we have this multiplier effect from what we're doing. But again, I want people to understand the concept of hard history. So part of the reason this history is not taught is because it is difficult to teach. It's emotionally draining. There's always resistance, and you have to have support at the highest levels to teach it effectively.
So often when I'm out presenting programs for the Tulsa Historical Society and Museum, and sometimes if I'm asked, well, we just want to know what's going on at the museum, tell us about it. And so I blah, 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 blah starts. And when I get to the part about I'm spending a lot of my time on education and collaboration about 1921, and invariably there's a in the room, and somebody very loudly says, why do we have to keep talking about this? Let's hear your best answer for why we have to keep talking about this.
I would pose another question. Are we comfortable with the state of race relations today? If we are, then maybe we don't need to talk about this. But I don't think any rational person is comfortable, or at least they shouldn't be. And part of the reason we are where we are today is because what was done yesterday and wasn't talked about, right? So we don't understand where we've been. So it's impossible to understand where we are. We have to really do our homework, get down to the nitty gritty in terms of our history, own up to the things that were done, take responsibility. So that's, I really support this 3-pronged process that moves us along the road to reconciliation, which involves acknowledgement, apology, and atonement. And so we're still in the acknowledgement phase, right, for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And then we are fortunate in Tulsa in that there have been some somewhat unique individuals who have owned the acknowledgement, were in positions where they could make apology. I think of former Mayor Susan Savage, former Mayor Kathy Taylor, former Police Chief Chuck Jordan. These are people who have all made formal public apologies for the missteps and misdeeds and tragedy that was 1921. And then atonement, when we get to the atonement phase, then we have to start talking about really difficult things like reparations and what does reparations mean? What does it look like? What are the possibilities? How do we do it together? So we have a lot of work to do, and it is difficult, as you mentioned, to hear from people who can't even get to the acknowledgement phase.
Yeah.
Years ago, I would hear people say, using the cliche, well, just let sleeping dogs lie.
I want to come back to the reparations because I have a number of thoughts or questions, I would say. So we'll put that one to the side. I want to go back to you often use the term, I've heard you say it, that history is whitewashed. And don't let me put words in your mouth as if I could, but my interpretation is that history has been written by the victors. And so, of course, that's how we have seen history. I think as we moved into the 1960s, with the women's rights, with civil rights, we began to hear from more voices, and we heard new perspectives. And I really believe that we're on the cusp of a new age in making space, more voices that we've never heard before. We're beginning to hear from, to hear what it was like for those who were slaves, and on through history, discrimination in so many different forms. So I think we're on the cusp of some new ways of looking at things, interpretation, which leads me to revisionist history. You want to talk about revisionist history, about taking monuments down and changing names of schools? Thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, to be perfectly honest, the mainstream history that I got was by definition revisionist because it wasn't accurate. It didn't give a full view of history, and it was from a unitary perspective that diminished, if not totally erased, the contributions and roles of people who were not of majority culture, were not white. That's the history that I got. So that by definition is revisionist history. As regards monuments and school names and all that, it's really not about revisionism for me. It's about deciding whom we elevate and whom we emulate.
I agree. Yeah.
So Robert E. Lee, people seized the power and privilege that they had to aggrandize Robert E. Lee. He's somebody consistent with the values that we want to convey today, and we want to inculcate in our children today. And for me, the answer is no. So when we take down Robert E. Lee's statue, what I want is some sort of textual, permanent marker that says, once upon a time, there was a statue of Robert E. Lee here. Here's how it got to be built. Here's why we took it down. And here's what's here now.
Yeah.
So I don't want to erase Robert E. Lee from our history. I certainly don't want to elevate and aggrandize
it. Yeah. I think the questions that need to be asked, or some of the questions are, who put it there? Who paid for it?
And
whose
why?
idea was it? What were they trying to say at the time? And what were they trying to say to future generations? I think those are the questions that you need to be asking. And then I'm not for destroying or throwing things in the landfill, but I think context certainly is important on that. Let's deal with reparations. I think that there are lots of people, particularly in the white majority, who are certainly willing to hear the history, to understand the story, to learn more about it, to be advocates, until you come to that big R word. And it's as if they grab their purses and their wallets. because they think it's going to cost them money. Um, what do you think reparations, what does that look like? How do we stay at the table and continue that conversation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a conversation that needs to be had. When you say people clutching their purses because they think it's going to cost them money, I wish that those same people would talk about the money that costs the Black community to have its wealth totally decimated, and so that wealth cannot be transferred intergenerationally, like white wealth gets transferred.
Yeah.
Or in even the broader context of reparations for slavery, you know, talk about the fact that people were exploited for their labor and not compensated for decades and centuries, and so we can have that conversation. So I think the bigger, more important conversation around reparations is at first definitional. Reparations means to make amends or to repair damage. Broad concept. It does not necessarily mean individual outlays, individual payments to particular. So when I think about reparations, I think in that broad context of repairing the damage done. So I have a list of priorities that I think are things that we need to do to repair the damage from the cataclysm in 1921. My first priority is curriculum reform, because it has a profound intergenerational impact on race relations and the ability to reconcile. So that's my first priority in terms of reparations. Then I strongly support collective forms of reparations, like building Greenwood Rising to tell the story in an experiential, immersive way, and to leverage that knowledge to challenge some of the issues around race that we have. That's another form of reparations. The building of John Hope Franklin Park, quite frankly, is a form of reparations. The idea is that it's on city land. It's partially funded by the state and private donors as well. But the idea is that it's a space for the community to come together, reflect on its history, and to begin to think about how to move forward together. That does the work of reparations, which means to repair or to make amends. Now, we get fixated on cash payments to particular individuals as the sine qua non of reparations, and that's not really the case. We can argue for that. That's probably the most difficult form of reparations to come by, particularly if you take the judicial route to getting there. We know, for example, the Rosewood riot of 1923, there were much smaller and fewer individuals involved. There were reparations provided in that instance, but the reparations came from the legislature, not through the judicial process. So I think that's just it's much more difficult to use litigation to get to that point because of the systems and our history. I think it makes it really difficult to do that. So we can talk about looking at legislative reparations in a state like Oklahoma. That seems to be relatively unlikely, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't have the conversation. I'm all for having the conversation because we know that reparations is something that absolutely must be addressed. We can talk about what form it should take. We can talk about who should do it, but
Which is one of my questions.
Yeah.
Who has that conversation?
So I think one of the things we want to do in Greenwood Rising is to provoke that conversation among all patrons who visit the facility.
Maybe we should back up and give you a chance to talk about Greenwood Rising. Yeah. That was later on in my program, but since you've mentioned it, why don't you go on ahead and...
So Greenwood Rising is the history center that's being built by the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial. I'm the local curator. I'm working with an exhibit design firm in New York called Local Projects. And the idea is that this history center will give visitors a holistic perspective on Tulsa's historic Greenwood district. So there are four principal galleries. Let me just briefly talk about the galleries. The first gallery is the Greenwood Spirit. So it talks about the O.W. Gurley and some of the early business owners and founders of the Greenwood District. It talks about the connection between Black folks in Tulsa and freedmen, people who are descendants of folks who were enslaved by the 5 civilized tribes and got land. It talks about all that stuff in the context of the Greenwood Spirit. These visionaries, these entrepreneurs, these business people, and so forth. The second gallery is Systems of Anti-Blackness, and that's a deliberately provocative gallery title because it talks about the arc of oppression, both in the United States more generally and in Tulsa specifically. And that's the gallery in which the massacre is included. So it's contextualized. Third gallery is Changing Fortunes, which talks about what happened post-massacre, the resistance to rebuilding, the actual rebuilding, the second peak in early 1940s to mid 1940s, the decline because of urban renewal and integration, 60s, 70s, and 80s, up to the report from the Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1941, which came out in 2001. And then the fourth gallery or section is kind of the reconciliation area. It's an area in which we raise contemporary racial issues and really charge our visitors with engaging around those issues, discussing them, iterating around concepts to challenge these issues and so forth. We also have a space for commitment because we want patrons of Greenwood Rising to recognize their own agency, their own roles and possibility in terms of being change agents, not passive recipients of this history, but active agents of change, knowing this history and working to solve some of the current issues we face. This is roughly a $25 million facility beyond the southeast corner of Greenwood and Archer on land that the commission owns, donated by the Hilly Foundation. And it will be, we think, a world attraction. Local projects, the exhibit and design firm in New York City, does work all over the world. They did the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. They did the 9/11 Museum in New York City. They do work quite literally all around the world. So this will be something special. It will be immersive and experiential. And it will be the talk of the town, if not the talk of the nation, for at least a while.
I would agree, and I'm glad to give you the chance to talk about it. Now let's go back to my question about reparations and who's at the table. We need to come together. Who are those people?
Well, I'm not one to let anybody off the hook. So somebody has to lead the conversation. But I think we've been talking about, if we define reparations broadly, then the linkage between reparation and reconciliation is, I think, palpable. Because the idea is to bring the community together, which requires healing some of the wounds of old. We're not going to reconcile unless we do some work in terms of healing the wounds of our history, which presupposes that we do something in the way of reparations. And again, Greenwood Rising is part of that. John F. Franklin Reconciliation Park is part of that. Curriculum reform is part of that. Cash payments to individuals. That's going to be an ongoing controversial topic. I don't know when we're going to get there, or if we're going to get there. I want to continue to talk about that, but I also want to simultaneously be doing things that really do repair some of the damage. My central point is that's not the only thing that we can do, nor is it the only thing that we need to do.
Yeah. Well, I'm always intrigued by people who say, so we all need to come together, and I'm never quite sure what they mean, what that looks like. I guess I probably just need to be more assertive in saying, tell me what you mean by that. we need to come together. What does that look like for you?
And tell me how you're going to help make that happen.
That's the
Don't
not
let
letting
don't let
anyone
people off the hook. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, in terms of race relations, what do you think Tulsa has done well?
I think we've done a number of things well, which does not mean that we are in a good place necessarily.
You know that my next question is going to be, what have we done not so well?
Okay.
So take it away.
So what we've done well, we've done philanthropy really well. We were blessed with some philanthropists who are visionary, who have done great things to bring the community together. For example, let's look at the sort of elephant in the room, gathering place. The whole concept behind gathering place is common ground that's accessible to people generally, so we can come together in a stress-free environment, engage with one another, build relationships over time, which ultimately will lead to enhanced trust in the community. Without trust, there is no reconciliation. So the Gathering Place is a great example of that kind of creative philanthropy that really helps us in terms of race relations without beating us over the head saying race, right? It's a different way of attacking the problem. So that's one thing we've done well. Organizationally, I would cite, because I've done a lot of work with OCCJ, the Oklahoma Center for Community and Justice, which for well over, 30 to 50 years, has done great work in just bringing people together interracially, interculturally, interreligiously, and hosting basic dialogues, just so people can have an opportunity in a facilitated way to engage with one another. And that has unquestionably resulted in building relationships, and those relationships can be relied upon in times of crisis, racial crisis or any other type of crisis. I think we've built a good safety net of nonprofits that focus on intercultural, interracial relationships, and we have creative, visionary philanthropists who are cognizant of the importance of the work that needs to be done around race.
Good. Okay. Let's visit just a little bit about the 1619 project. If you could describe for us how you were appointed, who funded this project, and describe your work as being one of the commissioners.
Yeah, so I'm a member of it's federal, it's called the 400 Years of African American History Commission. And the 1619 is the arrival of the first enslaved Africans 401 years ago. That's where the name 400 Years of African American History Commission comes from. It's a federally appointed body. Senator James Langford actually was really helpful and instrumental in getting me on that commission. And it's been a really great experience. We worked for almost a year without any funding, which was really difficult. But we got funding from Congress recently. So we are in the position now where we can award grants for creative projects that involve preserving the history and acknowledging the contributions of African Americans throughout the 400 years. So we're doing that. We've been hosting, and I actually facilitated a teleconference sponsored by AT&T on what I called regenerating the Black Wall Street mindset. And that is conversations about Black entrepreneurship, Black business, and how we instill in African Americans the historical legacy of Black entrepreneurship and Black business, and inspire folks to be more engaged today. So we are, in large part, we're mostly focused on making people aware of the 400-year anniversary and the contributions of African Americans across that span And we're doing it in part by funding local agencies and projects across the country.
Okay.
We were meeting in person and having events in various cities until COVID, and then
During
everything
COVID.
went haywire. Yeah.
Yeah. So your work will continue.
We actually sunset at the end of the 2021 fiscal year, unless we get extended.
Okay. Which hopefully you will with COVID. So today this 1619 project is being disparaged by some. You're getting some pushback. So what does that look like? Describe your obstacles. Are you just proceeding on?
Oh yeah, I mean the
let them have their
backlash,
say.
Yeah, it's not unanticipated. I mean, there are folks who don't want to talk about this history. They want to whitewash history. They don't want to talk about the legacy of slavery that continues to this very day, connect the dots. And they want to continue to not see people who look like them and not give those people a voice. And we're not having it. So you can go ahead and say all you want to, but this is a Pulitzer Prize winning project. It's a wonderfully scholarly, intellectual project. There's no question about that. Yeah. It is well documented. It's historically accurate. It's certainly troubling history. But we can't escape that. That is our history.
Yeah,
it is troubling.
And I think that there are a significant number of allies, other people who are. I know the Tulsa Historical Society and Museum. That's what we're committed to, is to telling all of the stories. And I just feel a real vibration, a real energy about lots of people committed to that. If you don't mind, I'm going to turn to, we've gotten some questions that have come in, and they're going to be a little bit random. Also, if you'd like to send us some more, it depends on how long Hannibal goes on with the answer. He has so much information, but here's one. Dear Mr. Johnson, thank you for your scholarly work. I think we all would agree with that. Do you have any instances where blacks and whites had a cordial relationship prior to the race attack and afterwards remained friendly, or worse, became bitter towards each other?
One example of the positive relations involves Dr. Charles Kerr, the pastor at First Presbyterian, who was, as I mentioned, an ally. He had friends in the black community. He actually physically had his son drive him downtown when the disturbance was about to break out, to try to quell and calm the white masses that were gathering and becoming more hostile. He actually worked after the massacre on getting reparations for the black community. He petitioned Congress. He was almost driven out of town by his own parishioners for his alliance with the black community, but he was so loved in the context of his own church community that he remained. So Dr. Charles Kerr is somebody that we should remember for bridging that racial divide at probably the darkest hour ever in the city's history.
Yeah. I know we also have lots of stories of particularly our friends from the Jewish community who were very helpful to Greenwood residents, et cetera, et cetera. So here's another one. If individual payments to either massacre survivors or victims' descendants, or to descendants of slaves broadly, were to be paid, what would it take to identify the eligible individuals today? Hard one.
That's the $64,000 question. So you have to develop criteria, even in defining who is a massacre survivor. So we have this event that occurred almost 100 years ago, and let's assume that someone was a life in being at that time, was just born, 3 days prior to the massacre. That person under some definitions, is a massacre survivor, correct? But that person has no individuated memories of the event. It is really difficult to come up with criteria for who gets these particular payments. Although we know that virtually the entire Black community, the Greenwood community, was obliterated. So some connection to that community, being a life in being, or the descendant of somebody who's passed on, would be part of the criteria. We'd have to figure out the relative amounts of the payments if they were made. I think that it's a challenge, but it's always a challenge. And there are other instances in which reparations were provided, and there have been criteria developed, so we could look to that by way of reference. For example, people of Japanese ancestry and their descendants who were interned in World War II received reparations from the federal government. What are the criteria? 9/11 victims received reparations. I know it was a really torturous, complex process to come up with criteria, but there are criteria. So I think we look at the available evidence, we come up with something that makes sense.
Okay. Here's another one. I've heard rumors about Dick Rowland and Sarah Page, the two teenagers in the elephant. Were they in a relationship?
The answer is we don't know. And the rumors really, I think, were stoked in part by Dick Rowland's mom, who gave an interview to Ruth Sigler Avery. Ruth Sigler Avery was the daughter-in-law of Cyrus Avery of Route 66 fame. Ruth, she wrote a manuscript. I actually met with Ruth a few times. She's been deceased for quite some time now, but she has a manuscript that's housed at Oklahoma State University. She interviewed a lot of people, including Amy Rowland Ford, Dick Rowland's mom. And in that interview, Dick Rowland's mother said that, or she intimated that Dick Rowland and Sarah Page were having an affair, that they got discovered, that it was taboo, and that really is the context in which the elevator incident occurs. We don't have any corroboration for that. I don't know that happened. I don't know that we'll ever be able to prove it, but it's interesting.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Here's another one about the massacre. Airplanes, no airplanes, airplanes with bombs. What do you think?
So one thing that we know definitively, and the sourcing on this would be the 2001 award-winning report from the Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. Airplanes were used during the massacre, period. What were the airplanes doing? Most likely, according to the commission and other evidence, the airplanes were, at a minimum, strafing the community with bullets from a gun. And it's likely that they were dropping something on the Greenwood community, some sort of incendiary device, could have been kerosene, nitroglycerin, whatever, that caused Molotov cocktails, that caused the flames to accelerate and the buildings to burn more quickly. The planes, according to the commission's report, were privately owned planes, and there are a number of eyewitness accounts, including really credible eyewitnesses like the lawyer B.C. Franklin, who has a really vivid account of planes dropping incendiary devices on the Greenwood community as he bore witness.
Okay. This person really wanted to ask everything. Bodies dumped in the river? Question mark.
The Race Riot Commission, again, this is the commission from 2001. I'm using the term race riot because that's the term that they used back in 2001. They concluded that it's unlikely, for a number of physical reasons, that bodies were dropped in the Arkansas River. But they concluded that there is some likelihood that there are mass graves in some locations in Tulsa, based on eyewitness testimony, and now based on scientific data collection. We haven't discovered any particular mass graves, but there are what's called anomalies under the ground when the archaeologists are doing their work. And so there's been a partial dig at Oaklawn Cemetery. There will be another partial dig sometime in the near future. And there are a couple of other sites, the canes along the Arkansas River near New Block Park, and what used to be Booker T. Washington Cemetery at 91st and Yale. Those are potential sites of unmarked mass graves of African Americans.
Did any Native Americans live in Greenwood or participate in the massacre in any way?
No, I want to say I don't know, although one of the things that we're going to feature in the History Center, Greenwood Rising, is an unpublished manuscript by a guy named Chalk Phillips, who was Choctaw. He was a teenager, and he was a witness to the massacre. He later became a Tulsa police officer. And he never published this manuscript, but I met with his son. His son donated the manuscript and the typewriter on which it was typed and some other artifacts that we're going to have in Greenwood Rising. So yeah, I mean, there was some Native American involvement in some way. I don't know that it's prominent. So, we're in Tulsa, Oklahoma, so some of the Black people who are in the Greenwood community are Native American.
Yeah, I think
we need to keep that in mind. Yeah.
Right. I absolutely would agree. And I would encourage our listeners to learn more about the allotment system and how that land was assigned, if you will, and who owned what land and sold to whom. And one of the best resources is in your abstract to go back that way. Okay. What do Black Americans wish that white Americans knew about racism? And how can well-meaning white persons be allies and advocates?
Okay. So a disclaimer, which should be obvious. I don't speak for the Black community. I only speak for me.
I think that's the first thing, is they're not monolithic.
Right.
And let's just start with that. Yeah.
So, but for me, one of the important things to understand, if you're white, is that racism is baked into the cake. So it's systemic and structural, and it permeates virtually everything. You can understand that. That's a big ask and a heavy lift if you're white to understand that. But it's important. And one of the simplest things that you can do is introspection or self-awareness. Sort of get in touch with yourself, figure out who you are, what is your cultural ancestry, what are your blind spots, what are your explicit and implicit biases. There are tools online that you can use, and there are organizations that can help you to get in touch with those things. Once you figure that out, then establish some intimate relationships across racial lines. And it's not about, oh, I have a Black friend. No, you don't have a Black friend. You have superficial relationships. You have acquaintances. Who do you know who is Black or Native or what some other race or ethnicity or culture who is an intimate to you, someone you deeply know and deeply care about. So if you have some of those folk who cross those various lines for you, then listen to them. See how they're experiencing the world. It's likely to be different from the way that you're experiencing it. Have a conversation about it. It's not that difficult, really.
I think I would say, instead of have a conversation, make that plural.
Right.
Yeah. Have
Conversations.
Yeah.
Starting with one. Yeah. But yeah. Absolutely.
Another one just came through. What amount of national newspaper or news coverage outside of Tulsa was occurring during the race riot?
It was covered all across the country. So yeah, there are headlines in all the big papers, the Times and all the big papers covered it to some extent. Keep in mind that what happened in Tulsa was magnified because of the relatively well-developed Black business community. But what happened in Tulsa was not unique in the United States. There had been many, many of these so-called race riots all throughout the United States. Again, culminating or peaking in about 1919 when there were more than 24 outbreaks in one single year. This comes on the heels of World War I. So newspapers were used to covering this, and depending on where you were, the coverage would be blame the victim type coverage, which is some of that happened, certainly happened here. You can see that evidence of that in the minutes of the city commission, the minutes of the chamber. Negro uprising was a term that was used for these events. And some of the coverage, depending on where you were, was much more sympathetic to the Black community that had been decimated.
Yeah. I would like to add that as a part of our resources on the Tulsa Historical Society's website are lots of those articles. In fact, we've just posted a good number of them, so that's another place for review. Speaking about the amount of national newspaper and news coverage, I would say not only during the race riot, but Hannibal, you have done countless numbers of interviews. I know I've done a significant number of too. And we who serve on the commission have known for a long time that the world will be watching as we approach this 100th anniversary and looking at what we've done well, what we haven't done as well, etc. So it's about time for us to end. I want to give you the closing. Let's put a spotlight on Tulsa, in that many documentaries are being developed, books are being written, and academic papers are being also written about Tulsa in 1921. You and others continue to tell the story. And then what? Pretend that this is the end of the semester, it's the last class. What are your parting words in terms of now what?
I think I'll borrow a quote that I use all the time, which has application in a lot of different arenas. But the famous tennis player and humanitarian Arthur Ashe said, "Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can." So if your interest is in improving race relations, promoting reconciliation, just ponder those words. Start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can.
Hannibal, thank you so much. We appreciate your endeavors, your continuous commitment to education, to producing books, to answering all the questions to all the media, your work with Greenwood Rising, the commission, and your service to the 400-year project, for all that you do and for being a good friend to Tulsa, being such a vital part of this community, a good friend to so many of us. Thank you all who chose to join us, and we look forward to many more conversations. Thank you all.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.